Distinguished panelists and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our webinar on India, China, US Complex Interdependence. To talk on this important and interesting issue, we have three excellent speakers. I'd like to welcome all the three distinguished panelists to our program. None of the panelists need any introduction. However, following the tradition, let me briefly introduce each of the speakers. First, we'll start with Professor S.D. Muni. Professor S.D. Muni is a Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also the member of IDSA Executive Council. Previously, he was associated with National University of Singapore, Banaras University, Banaras Hindu University, and University of Rajasthan. He served as India's special envoy to Southeast Asia, Asian countries on UN reforms, to the first National Security Advisory Board of India, and is the founding executive member of Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Colombo. In 2005, he was bestowed with Sri Lanka Ratan, Sri Lanka's highest national honor for a foreign nation. He has published more than 30 books and 200 research articles, and is the founder of many prestigious journals. Welcome to our program, sir. Second, we have Professor Walter K. Andersen. I had a chance to meet Professor Andersen in Shanghai when I was working at Tongji University. Professor Walter Andersen is Professor of South Asian Studies, School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining the SAIS, he served as Chief of the US State Department, South Asia Division in the Office of Analysis for the Near East and South Asia. He has published many books, and one of the most recent is The Brotherhood in Saffron, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and Hindu Revivalism. He holds in political science from Chicago. Professor Andersen, welcome to our program and thank you for your time. The third, we have Professor Swaran Singh. Professor Swaran Singh is the chairperson of Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, the School of International Studies, JNU. He is the president of Association of Asian Scholars, general secretary of Indian Association of Asia and Pacific Studies, and a visiting professor at the China West Normal University, Sciences Po, Australian National University, and others. He is the adjunct senior fellow at the Chahar Institute, Beijing, Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, and Sichuan University, Jinjiang College. He is also the editor in the editorial board of several journals and academic institutions. He has published several books. We welcome Professor Swaran Singh. Ladies and gentlemen, without much delay, let us start our program. We'd like to request all our participants to drop questions in the chat box or in the comment box in Facebook Live. Each speaker will have initial 15 to maximum 20 minutes. Make initial remark, followed by an answer. Let me start with Professor Muni. Professor Muni, the floor is yours.
Well, I wish you had asked Walter to launch the debate. He is in a better position, but I carry out your orders. I wish to make 2-3 very simple points. Number one, the India-US relationship is becoming strategically very strong, and this is being noticed all around. There is a lot of debate within India as to how we carried out our relationship with the US. And many people say whatever Nehru did was wrong. He should not have remained non-aligned. He should have been very close to the US. Frankly speaking, India always wanted to have very close and good relationship. That's why Nehru had the first state visit to the US. And while having a state visit to the US, I remember a letter he wrote to Krishna Menon, with whom he used to consult his foreign policy issues. And he said, and I'm quoting the letter, Krishna, why not we align ourselves somewhat with the US to build our economic, military, and technological capabilities? This is what Nehru's mindset was. But somehow the terms of engagement which were offered by the US to India were not palatable to Nehru, because Nehru, the US wanted India to be a military ally of the US, and that too in a subordinate level like many other allies. And this obviously was not acceptable to India and the Nehru, because India did not want to, having seen the way 2 world wars had come up, did not want to get into military alliances. So the relationship started drifting, but the drift started with the mid-50s. And I have sometimes debated with friends like Ashley Tellis and many others that to blame India that it did not have relationship with the US because of the former Soviet Union is absolutely untenable. From 1947 until 1953-54, India had no great relationship with the former Soviet Union. And in fact, in 1952, India had very clearly said Soviet Union and Stalin was offering a treaty to India, and Nehru said, no, go ahead, don't go ahead, just hold on, and we are not interested in that. It was actually the Kashmir issue and the repeated use in the the United Nations Security Council that forced India to revise its decisions. And the first military relationship with India had with the USSR was somewhere near after 1960. We used to buy our arms mostly from the Britain and France, and not from the former Soviet Union. Anyway, this is a historical explanation which I wish to give you, because even after that, India had very useful relationship with the US during the Suez crisis, and later on, subsequently, whether it is Bangladesh war or later on even President Reagan's time, India has consistently tried to build relationship with the US. But you know, there are different centers of power and influence, and Walter would correct me later on, that what many times the US president wanted could not be carried out because of the pressures from the State Department and Pentagon and various other stakeholders which were very effective on US policy towards various other countries. But anyway, I'm happy that that turn has come about with the beginning of the century. And not only on the nuclear issue, but even in terms of arms and others, the Indo-US relationship is going reasonably strong. And I think that will continue to go reasonably strong. Though my feeling is that an element of what India repeatedly calls the strategic autonomy would remain. And perhaps it would be unwise or unreasonable or unrealistic for the US to expect that India could be anything like a full ally like South Korea or Japan or Australia. So the difference would always remain, but the strategic proximity between India and the US has tremendously increased. We are looking for not only arms, we are looking for technology, we are looking for trade, and we are looking for cooperation and understanding on various global issues. Now, China is taking exception to this. And China is taking exception to this because they think this weighs heavily against their interest. Some of us in India want to remind China that you were very close to the US and you wanted to balance yourself with the former Soviet Union for one reason or another. And at that time, we had no objections to your proximity with the US. We did not take the Chinese proximity to the US necessarily against India, though it did impinge on India, particularly on the ASEAN. And you remember that Vietnam issue in which India was very keen that Vietnam should be accepted into the Asian dynamics, and both China and the US did not want this to happen during the 70s and probably early 80s. So we can recall those periods, and the Chinese objection to Indo-US relationship, which seems to factor their approach towards India, and maybe Swaran would deal with that, is not logical and not tenable. Now, relationship with China has always been up and down. With US, there was a consistency. India had wonderful relationship with China during the early 50s. And on the kind of trust built up, which was shaken up during, the disturbances in Tibet, when Dalai Lama came and formed a government in India. And India had sympathies with the Tibetan cause, at least in terms of their cultural autonomy and independence, which they were asking, not politically. So though India has accepted one China policy, but it respects the human rights assurances which were given to the Tibetans by the Chinese and accepted by the international community. Today, now we are entering a phase where there is a fierce competition between US and China. And there are also elements of uncertainty as to how these great power equation would settle down. There is a lurking fear, which is now increasingly getting reduced, that there should not be a sort of collaboration between these two great powers to dominate Asia. India has always found it very uncomfortable to accept hegemony of any one country, whether it is US or now if China is going to claim for it. And I think we will continue to oppose it and would want China to accept international norms, international rules, and be more transparent than what it is. So there is a bit of tension between India and China relationship, which gets linked up with the huge tension which exists and is evolving between the US-China relationship. But on the whole, and I would conclude here, on the whole, India would maintain a balance as far as possible, unless driven to the wall by the Chinese, which I suppose they would not, because probably Chinese would need India as much as India needs China. And there are certain structural contradictions in which it is not possible for India to align completely and side completely with any of them. In terms of the interest, in terms of what you call inheritance, heritage, culture, location, geostrategic factors, whatever you have. So there would be an effort on the part of India to maintain a balanced relationship between US and China. But certainly, I think it is for India, of course, has aspirations of Asian sanctuary. In fact, the Asia for Asians is a Nehru's idea. And India vigorously pursued Nehru's ideas during the 50s and 60s. Unfortunately, he could not concretize it because India had no economic power to support it. And the two wars which we had with Pakistan and China completely shattered India's vision of forming Asia into one formation. Now the Chinese are talking about Asian sanctuary. And I briefly want to say to the Chinese that you will never have an Asian sanctuary if you can't carry the Asian neighbors along with you. And Asian neighbors is not only India. Asian neighbors are the Koreans, Asian neighbors are also the Japanese, Asian neighbors are the Southeast Asian countries and South China Sea countries. And unless you sort out your problems with them and have a harmonious relationship with them, Asian dream, the dream of Asian solidarity or the Asian sanctuary is too far to meet it in absence of that. But having said that, India would continue to play its constructive role, would not like to have any conflict either with the US or with China, would certainly like to depend upon the US and have a close collaboration with the US in building its own capabilities and ensuring that peace and stability is sustained in Asia. I would conclude here and then come to specific questions which are there. I have not touched on economic issues. I am not an economist, but it is a world and a century of economic exchanges, economic engagement. India is very conscious of it, but it has several limitations in terms of its own economic performance. It has improved considerably, is improving considerably, but still the goal is too far. And I think we have to work very hard to make our economic capabilities, which only will sustain our aspirations and vision for a role in Asia.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Professor Walter Andersen to make his remarks?
Thank you. I want to just say a few things, and because I think the most interesting part of this discussion will be the questions and answers that we give to each other on specific points. But to get to, so follow up on Professor Muni's very good comments, which focused on strategic issues. Actually, in my mind, there are three sets of issues, maybe four, if you include why did the Chinese get so assertive up in Ladakh at this time? What was it? And we might want to go into that because that will, help structure, the continuation of the issue and what it is. I have some opinions on that, and I'll say that in a few minutes. The next is the point that Professor Muni focused on, strategic issues, where you look at the various countries. And I want to say something about Russia as well, because I think they play a role in all of this. And then there is the border itself. The Prime Minister has said he's not going to give an inch. But in the meetings yesterday, apparently the two sides agreed to an incremental withdrawal from the areas of conflict. And apparently there are technically 4, though most of them take place in one particular location. I haven't seen, maybe some of you have seen the details of that. I haven't seen the details of that, except the announcement was that it would be incremental and over time. And then the third sort of set of interests is domestic. And on that, by and large, I think in the Indian domestic situation is that there is, outrage, popular outrage on one hand at what happened. And secondly, largely supportive of the Prime Minister. In fact, if this criticism is at all, is that this was allowed to happen or happened at all. Now in the US, it's interesting. This is one issue in where there is bipartisan support across the political spectrum in the US. There are very few, for those of you who follow US politics, but this is one in which there is. And both sides support India. Both sides, the emotional and the strategic focus is definitely on the side of India. Not so far as to say there should be, and this is, I think, something that India should avoid, as Professor Muni mentioned, a military alliance. So there is incrementally closer ties between that has strategic consequences between the U.S. and India. I think of the logistical agreement that we had so that the U.S. could use Indian facilities for repair and other things. And a similar one has recently been signed with Australia, one of the Quad countries. So let me sort of briefly look at on the strategic, on why this started. I personally agree with Mr. Ranaday's argument, which I'm sure all of you have read, that a large part of the reason for this is the instability and the problems that President Xi was facing in China itself. I happen to agree with that. As you alluded, I taught where we met at Tongji University for the last 10 years for several weeks, twice a year, graduate students. And the sense I got from interacting with Chinese strategic thinkers, and more recently their views, is a sense that the government felt somewhat under pressure because of, and here again, if you read social media in China, which I do, much gets through the various barriers that the government has put up to monitor that. But there's a lot of criticism of the virus. Apparently is much more extensive than has been officially reported. And this is one of the problems in following Chinese. And as you know from having been in Shanghai, you're never quite sure, whether the information is true or not, because it's all state controlled and it has a certain perspective. And I recall going to the headquarters, because I knew the head of foreign affairs at Wanweibao, which is one of the major newspapers in China, and going around the room, and one after the other was saying, we get, on a daily basis, we get something from the ministry that controls communications about what we shouldn't say and how should we say it. Except for a couple areas. I got to the sports guy, and the sports guy said, we get very little instructions from the government as to how, and the other one was travel. We get very little on travel because Wanweibao has it is a journal that appeals to Chinese intellectuals and has ever since its founding. So that's one of the issues one faces when you rely on Chinese media or journalists, to be quite frank. I'm sure you all know that. Anyway, he argues that a big part of the cause is the domestic problem. Now, if that in fact is the case, that's difficult to handle, because that's little that anybody else can do that can handle that situation. It's one that's a domestic situation that is, you know, more or less dependent on circumstances that outside powers have very little to do. Another argument I've read that I'm somewhat sympathetic with what I hear is that the Chinese are concerned about a close relationship between the US and India. For them, that's a nightmare scenario, which they will do almost anything to avoid. And one of the reasons for this might have been, beside the other one I just mentioned, might have been, you know, to warn India not to get too close to the United States. But if anything, you know, this will drive it closer than had been the case before, particularly if you find more incidents like this popping up in China. So let's take just the U.S. Professor Muni had said that, you know, you have range of interests in the U.S. That so shape foreign policy, and I think that is true. And historically, the Pentagon has tended to be pro-Pakistani because of the military-to-military relationship, and Pakistan was more willing to be, you know, outwardly supportive of the U.S. and its objectives. That diminished over time. It should have diminished earlier, and many people in the U.S. were writing that it was a kind of relationship that couldn't be sustained given Pakistan's own interests. Then you had the Afghan issue come up and Pakistan's importance on the Afghan issue as well. Pakistan really hasn't entered the debate in the U.S. that I've seen on this issue. I mean, the support, as I said, has been across the board. And at least I haven't heard any sort of, you know, argument that, oh, we have to be careful because we have to worry about, you know, upsetting the Pakistanis. That was the case in the past. I've seen much less of that today. I think it's increasingly recognized here that a growing India is important in the balance of power in China, in Asia, and a strong India is to our advantage, whether or not there is a military agreement with India. And I think most people recognize that the Indians don't want a formal military agreement, at least not under present circumstances. And I think that's probably healthy for India, and it's also healthy for the U.S. if that does not happen. Trade interest, given the growth of Indian trade and the Indian economy, is of increasing importance to the U.S. And I think it needs to be picked up somewhat. And I recall a speech a couple of years ago at the dedication of the Carnegie Institute in New Delhi when the External Affairs Minister had said, among his many points, that it was critically important for India to develop its economy to play a significant role in world affairs. I think that's true. What India needs to do, it needs to take steps that enhance its economy, and that is including the welcoming external investment in Indian industry. On that, there is an issue. You probably all know I've done a recent book on the RSS, and within the RSS family of organizations, there are several that are very much opposed to that. So there is an internal, you know, debate about whether external foreign investment and involvement in the Indian economy is a good thing or not. I personally think it's a good thing. I think India is big enough to handle investment from overseas, from, you know, undermining its sovereignty. But it's something that has to happen. And there's apparently too little investment going on now, and I'm not quite sure what, as you know, like Professor Muni, I'm not an economist, but I think that there needs to be more investment in India to grow the economy. U.S., another difference now than even 10 or 20 years ago is there's a very large Indian American community in the United States, maybe 3.5 million, perhaps somewhat more, but they're unusually wealthy. It's the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States. They're unusually well educated. And if you look at any newspaper, particularly looking at the Wall Street Journal, which is the major economic newspaper in the United States, you see Indian names, you know, getting positions of authority and influence in various corporations in the United States. It is a community that is increasingly important. One of the major candidates, perhaps as the vice president for Joe Biden, is a senator from California whose mother is Indian. And she, as her first name implies, she, you know, is concerned, you know, she has an interest in things Indian. She has family in India. But she's not the only one. There is a strong segment of the Indian American community that's Republican, though not nearly as large as the number who are Democrats. The Indian American community in the past has overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic Party and probably still will. Though on the issue of India, the Indian Americans get a lot of support, as I mentioned, across the political spectrum, from business, from government, and even in the Pentagon these days. The other strategic interests that I have beside India's relationship with the United States is India's relationship with Russia. Russia was historically a country that India had turned to when it had problems with the US and then later with China, and it may be doing the same today, that people are gathering in Moscow for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And discussions, I'm told in the press, that discussions are being held about the acquisition of Russian equipment. And in fact, and that's logical because almost one half the Indian equipment is of Russian origin. And the Russians so far have been very cautious in their handling of this issue. I think that they recognize that, in fact, they have their own sense that there has to be, a balance in power. It's not in their interest that China become a hegemonic power in East Asia either. So I think the Indians recognize that there is that caution in the Russian side, and so they, have feelers to improve the relationship with Russia, which I think is probably a good thing, and including with the U.S. and with the Quad countries as well. On the issue of the border, I just wanted to say something very briefly on that. Both sides have rushed troops to the border, rushed equipment to the border. The Indians have continued to improve the infrastructure and this to catch up with the Chinese who have already done that. I think the Indians will continue to do that as they did at the other side of the Doklam issue a couple of years ago. They have continued to sort of build up their infrastructure resources there. It's to their advantage to do so. And I think they will continue to do so, which will be very irritating to the Chinese because the Chinese obviously want room for maneuver. What I think has to happen, however, and even the Chinese press is frank about this, is the lack of a firm sense of where the line of actual control is a part of the problem that you have between the two sides. In fact, the Chinese press has tended to emphasize this point rather than saying this was a deliberate effort, is that there is confusion as to what is the actual line of control. And there is confusion over that. But I'm told that, one of the reasons for that is the Chinese have been unwilling to exchange maps, given the actual line of control between the two sides, or to sit down and ink an agreement as to what it is. And I think that, the Indians have to press them in that, and maybe the international community, because this, in a sense, is a source of the problem. And, given the Chinese assertiveness, where there is doubt anywhere, including this area, they tend to push to see the response of the other side. And so I think this has to be a major priority of any Indian government, is to make sure that there is an agreed upon line of actual control. Now that's somewhat difficult given the mountainous area, but not impossible. We have the technology. I'm told by my friends who work on that issue here in the US, that this is something that can be done, particularly with satellite imagery and other technologies that can be done. But both sides have to agree to it. I think the Indians would like to agree to it. So far, the problem has been on the Chinese side. Just a word about the domestic situation, the third sort of set of issues here. In the U.S., there's really no debate. I mean, it's very favorable to India. And in fact, I was watching the news this morning, and a certain segment on two of the major cable news networks had to do with this issue between India and China. Editorials have been very favorable in the U.S., reflecting sort of the range of interests I talked about earlier. In India itself, from what I'm reading, and all of you would know better than me, is that on this issue, I think the Prime Minister has gotten support, where the criticism is that he didn't go far enough in pushing the Chinese. But I think he's also been somewhat cautious. I think I don't think he obviously don't want to push to a situation where you have war break out. It's to no one's advantage, and so somewhat care. But at the same time, let the Chinese know that India is not about to give up territory, as it was indicated at Doklam, when in fact both sides pulled back and both declared victory. Now, when two sides declare victory, my years in the State Department told me that means that obviously something is going right when everyone says that there's a victory, which happened at the Doklam situation, but it was diffused. And I think in this particular case, two sides, and yesterday's agreement seemed to indicate they were beginning to begin to pull back on the issue. Now, as I look at, the Chinese press has been much less focused on this issue than has the Indian press, in part because this is not one of the key areas of Chinese security. It is an area, but not one of the key areas of Chinese security. So they're much more concerned about the South China Sea, Taiwan, West China, Hong Kong, than they are about this. So this has gotten some press coverage, but much less. Now, in my many years in China, one thing I discovered when I first went there, there was a certain contempt of India in China. And to a certain extent, that still exists. And you can see that if you read Global Times, particularly more blatant in the 2017 issue by Bhutan than today. And I think that reflects a increasing appreciation of India. The Chinese respect countries that sort of demonstrate strength and ability to get economy moving, and they see India on a path in this direction. They don't want to say go too fast and with too many international connections, because that could be problematic for them. But they do respect that. And the very fact, I think, that the Prime Minister has reacted the way he has, not shoving the Chinese, but telling them, don't shove against us, I think is probably appreciated. And it seems to be indicative of what the Chinese press seems to be saying. They've been remarkably careful about not attacking him as a person, which I find interesting. I think that they find him someone that they can work with, hence all the meetings back and forth that they've had with each other. That might be, in the long range, something that's good in terms of working out some kind of an agreement. Now, what's going to happen in the future, the sort of last set of issues I want to talk about, a lot depends on how they handle this agreement yesterday to see if they actually begin to fall back. But as I mentioned earlier, I think they have to work out something that has to do with the line of actual control, something that firms that up. Because unless they do, even accidents can trigger something that's much more significant, because there are accidents every day, in that very mountainous area. And as you saw from the number of Indian soldiers, many of them were killed because in very narrow areas, they were literally shoved off a cliff. But I think it's something that has to be done. Otherwise, I think you're going to have recurrent problems. Some of them accidental that can be built into something bigger, or some that are perhaps more deliberate, as this appears to have been. Thanks. I appreciate and I look forward to this conversation we have back and forth.
May I now request Professor Swaran to make his remarks?
Thank you. After these two very erudite and excellent presentations, I hope, first of all, my internet works fine and you are able to hear me as I speak. I see a lot of young scholars on my screen. So I thought, let me go back to my class. We are looking today on US, China, India, complex interdependence. So give me a minute to first talk about brass tacks. We often hear that nations, communities, people are dependent on each other. And conceptually, dependence means when our state of being, or let us say the state policies, get influenced from outside. That means there is a situation of dependence. Then there is something called interdependence. And in interdependence, there is going to be mutual impacting of each other's life, culture, and policies, which are mutual, but they would involve both cooperation and conflict or avoidance of active relationship. But we are today discussing this three countries relationship in a template of complex interdependence. And complex interdependence involves a whole multivariate engagements, interactions, transactions that occur between not just the states, but several other actors within the state, so inter-society relationships also, and a whole range of sectors where relationships happen. And here now, these are not simple, bilateral, mutual, and equal. They are complex network of relationships that occur, except that each of the actors involved here have to constantly explore to ensure what we call multiple equilibria in this relationship of major stakeholders, which state gets a certain amount of primacy in giving a broader direction to that relationship. Works on this kind of relationships between major powers began soon after Second World War. And you may have heard names like, for example, Raymond Leslie Boyle, who first started looking at how the reordering of economies, cultures, and races was happening, because after Second World War, you were beginning to see sparks of decolonization. Then, of course, we moved into Second World War. Realism became dominant theory until about late 60s, when for the first time Richard Cooper, for example, started questioning realism.
Some problem with internet.
Yeah, I can't, I can either see him or hear him.
Yeah, I can't hear you.
I think the connection is sapped.
Are we still connected with the speaker?
Yes, he's seen on the screen, but
Because I don't see him.
Me too, I don't see him. Nobody sees him.
okay. So we're not sure when we'll get to connect with him. So maybe we'll start with the question and then we'll ask Professor Swaran to continue. There are lots of questions for Professor Muni. Let me start with.
No, I'm back, if you are able to see.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I apologize, the internet today is not really very in a happy mood as far as I am concerned. So let me go back to the interdependence and complex interdependence that I was discussing, as to how all stakeholders have to then build multiple equilibria in that relationship is where it is important. And I was saying the most important work which was raging the debate when I was young student like you was in late 70s work of Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye. And they were explaining how this complex interdependence is the locomotive of transformation in world politics or international politics, as they said. So we are looking at now China, India, and United States as seen as the three major in how world is gradually reordering itself, and how are they engaging each other in that complex interdependence, and in what direction is that complex interdependence taking them forward. One major qualification of existence of this template, or as a best explanation in any relationship, are three things. One, complex interdependence believes that there is no fixed, rigid hierarchy of issues or actors which defines complex interdependence among major stakeholders. Second, it transcends the state and it moves into multiple actors beyond the state. So we are talking here of several other actors who are constantly influencing the relationship. And the third one, which is the most important, they believe that the complex interdependence is shifting the predominance of military-centric alliance-based relationships to more complex and economy-driven relationships, which are then enhancing elements of cooperation and reducing elements of conflict. And these are important things one can notice. Parts of them exist in the trilateral relationship of US, Russia, US, China, India, but some of them are also missing. Let me give you some very quick examples of the transformation that has occurred in last 30 years in the relationship. For instance, the biggest locomotive of change in 30 years has been China's economic rise. Underline the economic part of it. So China is not yet the superpower, it's only the economic superpower as of now. And what that did, until the beginning of 1990, the bilateral trade of United States and China was $11 billion. It touched $700 billion in 2018. Of course, the trade between India and US, India and China also increased, but not the way US-China trade increased, which transformed the relationship. That's not the only thing. Trade as a component of their respective GDPs also changed. For instance, in case of China again, in 1990, the trade as a percentage of China's GDP was less than 30%, 29% to be exact. And it reached so rapidly forward that in 2006, for example, it had hit 71% of GDP of China. It has come down since then because of global demand going down, because of global slowdown since 2007 and 8. And of course, internal consumption of China also increasing over a period of time. Likewise, India's trade as a share of GDP also expanded in that period from 15% to 55%. In case of United States, where consumption is largely domestic, the shift was only from 20% to 30%. So what are drivers of national economy, what are therefore drivers of national policies have transformed that have expanded mutual stakes of these three powers together. So therefore, when Prime Minister Modi for the first time went to China in May of 2015, he gave a speech at the world famous Tsinghua University. And Modi said in that speech that if the last century was one that was age of alliances, this is an era of interdependence. That meant that leaders of these three countries also fully realize that they are currently living in a template of complex interdependence. But it's not a perfect picture of complex interdependence the way Robert Keohane, Joseph Nye have explained to us, because any theory, when you put that into practice, gets into all kind of erosions. So let me give you a recent example of 2018 National Defense Strategy report of President Trump. After 17 years, they have removed terrorism as the most important threat to national security of the United States and put interstate competition as the most important threat to United States national security. In fact, they've gone as far as to say that the military modernization of China is ultimately aimed at replacing US preponderance in the world. So very specifically mentioning China. So that means starting from 1995, when you had the tension in the straits between Taiwan and China, and the United States had taken active action in that, security contestations have also continuously expanded. And security contestations of India and China are very visible, and Professor Andersen told us a lot about that. But at the same time, with all those contentions, China today is the largest source of imports in India. A lot of them need not be imported, but that is the truth. World famous hydroxychloroquine of India or Pentacid of India, which is going to 60 countries, their active pharmaceutical ingredients, the raw material comes from China. So there is complex interdependence where there are tensions, conflict, but also enormous working together, which is happening at the same time. Now, my last point is, as we are drifting into this complex interdependence where conflict is also becoming constantly visible, the reality is that difficulty that these three today are facing is how to ensure what I said in the beginning, the multiple equilibria in that complex relationship, which is building states across economies, across political elites, across intellectuals, media, people, all kinds of startups in India are funded by, all your top e-commerce companies in India, all top 10 are funded by Chinese. So there is a complex interdependence. What my last point is, to say, as China's rise continues, and a rather rapid rise, and COVID-19, at least the Chinese believe, will give them a leapfrog. Because according to April 2020 IMF report, US economy is shrinking by 6%. Chinese economy will be growing according to IMF by 1.2%. Chinese don't believe that. Chinese believe that the IMF calculations do not consider China having come out of COVID-19. So they believe that the economy is going to really leapfrog much faster. And in purchasing power parity, Chinese economy before COVID-19 was about $5 trillion bigger than the United States. So that sudden leapfrog is making that multiple equilibrium or multiple equilibria, as we say, a very, very difficult exercise to achieve. And that is why what we are seeing and will continue to see is if China continues to rise rapidly, its wolf warriors, its assertive policies, its historical claims will become far more visible to all of us. And that will keep constantly pushing India and the United States closer to each other. And that is where the complex interdependence equilibria is becoming possible for all three states. And I don't think any state here has a larger option to step out of that relationship. That is what explains your three foundational agreements that India has now signed with the United States. India inviting Australia most likely into Malabar exercises. India getting more interested in Indo-Pacific debates. Indo-Pacific itself shifting from Quad to Quad Plus. Some of that template of complex interdependence, I think, beautifully explains how the equations between US, China, and India are evolving and in what direction they are going to move in future. I think that is my quick assessment, but I look forward to any counterintuitive comments that you may have that will help me learn a little more on their equations and better understand their equations. I also look forward to any questions that you may have, and I'll try to answer them. I apologize for my internet briefly, creating a little trouble, but I hope it wasn't too much for you. I can still see about 69 people with us. So I want to thank all the participants for sparing your very important time of evening to be with us. And I really look forward to the rest of the session and to hear my other colleagues also making comments. Thank you. Back to Pramod.
Thank you, sir. There are another 30 to 35 people watching us live on Facebook at the moment. Let me go to the quick questions. We'll start with Professor Muni. What do you think of the mediation offer from Trump on Pakistan, India, and India-China issues? That is for Professor Muni. Second, I'll put three or four set of questions, and then we'll ask the speaker to comment on it. Second is, how far is it pragmatic that India would strategically align with US by overlooking its immediate neighbor, China? Third question for Professor Muni is, how can Nepal contribute in bringing good environment between the complexities of India-China relation and benefit from those two growing economies at the same time? Fourth is, how do you think India can balance between Pakistan and China as both are trying to push India at borders? Let me put 3 or 4 questions to Professor Walter Andersen. Recently, John Bolton's book reveals that Trump wants to get help from Xi Jinping to win the election. If that is true, can it mean that Trump is having a closer relationship with China than that of India, and how the future prospect of relationship between India and US can be developed? Second question from Professor Walter is, why is Indo-Pacific region becoming a contested region for US, China, and India? Third question from Professor Walter is, to what extent the US can go to stop China from flexing its muscle against India, especially when the US itself is highly dependent on China and there is no military pact between India and the US like US has with Japan and South Korea. Fourth question for him is, in the book Rise and Fall of Great Powers, Henry Kissinger, he says that China is in the height of economic or military power, and how long will it take for it to stabilize? What will be the consequences of election of Joe Biden on India and China? We have got 3 questions for Swaran Singh. We'll get more maybe in a while. While talking of current global and economic, while talking of current global economic and political scenarios and of expected new global format, the world may be witnessing a fundamental shift in the very nature of its leadership and governance. As the COVID-19 affecting almost all the country's economy at a different length and magnitude with a penetration effort thereof, how India forced it to play a role to balance the future world order, as the pandemic could be a mischievous or an opportunity for some powers to drive a new global order. Second question is, what is China's long-term goal for its line of actual control conflict? Why US does not support India openly? Third is, considering ongoing posturing of India on its border and US in South China Sea, how India will defend its one nation policy. How should India take advantage of China's this particular policy? Maybe we can start with Professor Muni.
Well, before I come to specific questions, Pramod, permit me to make very brief comments on what Walter has said and one comment on Swaran Singh, and then I take the questions directly. Walter devoted a lot of good time on the border issue between India and China. And you are right that this is one of the most critical issues today. You said the Chinese don't take India as a security problem. This border is not a security problem. This may be true so far as the Chinese media is concerned, because the Chinese filter a lot of news. They don't let whatever happens, their people to know. And we are realizing it on the border issue these days, particularly through social media. But let me tell you that Ladakh is absolutely critical from the Chinese security point of view as they view at the world. And I'll tell you how. Number one, Ladakh is very close to Aksai Chin, where the Karakoram highway goes, then it goes to Pakistan, and they have now developed stakes in the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, where billions of dollars have been put in there, in the projects there. Now, if as the political statements from India have come, that we want to take back POK, and we also want to take back Aksai Chin, has in a way rattled the Chinese, and that's why this concentration on Ladakh is so critical these days. You would recall that when Chu Enlai came to Nehru and wanted to offer a swap agreement for the border settlement, what did he offer the Indians? He says, we will forget about Arunachal Pradesh if you forget about Aksai Chin. So Aksai Chin, for the Chinese calculation from way back in the mid-50s, was far more critical than even Arunachal Pradesh, which used to be called Nifa there. And this is largely because of their two vulnerable peripheries, which is Tibet and Xinjiang, where the Aksai Chin issue comes up very, very critical. Even today, they are quite worried about Xinjiang and Tibet. And that's why they don't want India to strengthen its infrastructure or become a viable challenger in this part of the world, which links them up with their own relationship with Pakistan, and also in terms of their own internal regions of Xinjiang and Tibet and the infrastructure of Karakoram and other highways which they have done. And I have a feeling that despite all the military agreements or whatever else it is, the Chinese would find it very hard to dismantle themselves from whatever they have done in Ladakh, in Galwan Valley, or in the Pangong Lake. This is what my assessment is, and I hope I am wrong about it. But I think this area is very critical from the what you call mini security perspective of the Chinese. Of course, not in the global sense, but when it comes to the region of South Asia, this is very critical. Global sense, South China Sea and various other issues may be very important. Coming back to Swaran, you're talking about interdependence and emphasizing the economic aspect. Look, the Chinese made up their economic growth as fast as you have described, largely because of the blessings of the US. The US gave them not only their market, but gave them technology, and part of the technology was stolen by the Chinese. I think Walter would tell me, I have read Pillsbury's book, how China got totally integrated into the American system and took as much advantage of this as possible. to say that economy can grow and expand itself without strategic blessings or strategic consent is somewhat unrealistic. And today what you find that China, while having very good economic relations and very close economic relations with most of the countries in Asia and the world, there is a very strong strategic dichotomy, which the Chinese have developed largely because of their hegemonic and assertive posture which they have taken. Now, to what extent this dichotomy and lack of balance between the strategic stakes and the economic stakes can continue, I think is a subject of great debate between us. I have a feeling that eventually the strategic factors would prevail, because economy, we did not have economic relationship with the US because we were not a preferred strategic country at that time. Now it is growing on. It is nearly, US is the second largest if you look at China, both in terms of trading and technology partnership. And it can grow much more as you have the political and strategic issues sorted out very, very clearly. This is what I wanted to say about these two very important comments which have been made by two panelists. Secondly, coming to the questions specific, mediation by Trump, it's a joke, yeah. We don't take it seriously. Firstly, India does not accept any mediation in India-Pak relationship. We accepted it earlier. We even invited the Americans and the British to adjudicate on the Kashmir issue. And we found that was absolutely counterproductive, and we don't accept. So far as mediation between India and China is concerned, again, we are not looking for a mediation. And there is no way that, the Trump seriousness is known to everybody. And the kind of comments which he makes, nobody takes him seriously on some of these rhetorical aspects. Align against US and China, I have answered that in the sideway in which we are having what you call chats. I have already answered it. Look, firstly, we are not for alliance. The alliance world is gone. It is now a world of strategic partnerships. Even the Americans have redesigned their alliances, even with Japan. For instance, they have relaxed the Japanese alliance much more. And everywhere, nobody is talking about alliance. We are talking of the partnership. So there is no question, and I repeatedly underline that India would never be what you call a formal, formatted ally of the US or of any other country. But we will have strategic relationships. And in fact, Walter made a very interesting reference to Quad, or I think Swaran made a reference to Quad. We would like Quad to be expanded, not only for the 4 countries, certainly 2-3 countries which need to be brought in: Vietnam, Indonesia, and possibly Singapore. If it is there, that would make a really Asian conglomeration, and it would be what you call a plural decision-making theater or a forum for Asian affairs, which will put there. So no question of aligning with the US. So far as China is concerned, China is opposing India everywhere. It is the Chinese who are pushing us much closer to the US. I hope Walter would bear me out, because everywhere they are opposing, whether UNSC, Security Council, whether it is NSG, whether it is a question of Pakistan, whether it is a question of naming the what you call terrorists, or anywhere else. The Chinese are opposing India. They see in India a rival. We are far behind the Chinese. We keep telling them. We will still take decades to catch up with them. Why are they so worried about it? But they are the ones who are, and as I mentioned to you, on the Asian century, it would not be an Asian century unless India and China. China thinks that it has to collaborate with its Asian neighbors. Nepal, I'm sorry, India and China have many points of engagement with each other, and I don't think they need a third country really to engage with each other if they really want to engage with each other. And it is good for Nepal to aspire for that relationship, but I don't think either China or Nepal is looking for that. Pakistan and China have China has found Pakistan as a strategic ally for various reasons. India is one of the factors. But whole of Indian Ocean and you know, the Arab and Persian Gulf area, why are they building Gwadar? Why did they start using Karakoram Highway even for the Islamic connectivity? They used to send many of their people to Hajj via Pakistan, largely because of that. They have several and now they are sinking billions of dollars in Pakistan, which they would like to control Pakistan in order to you know, reap benefits out of this investment which they are making into Pakistan. So Pakistan, China, we see as a very close alliance. I mean, I don't believe that China would fight a war for Pakistan. I don't believe that. But except when it comes to the Ladakh area of Karakoram Highway, there is a possibility of the Chinese extending all support to Pakistan in order to deter India from damaging their stakes and their interests. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Prof. Andersen to make his comments?
Let me just say something on Trump's offer to mediate the issue. This is not his first effort in this direction. He had another offer of mediation even earlier on another question. I think this is his a lack of training, to be quite frank, in foreign policy. I'm surprised he didn't listen to his India experts at the State Department or elsewhere, that this was something that India certainly was not going to accept. And in fact, the Chinese didn't accept either. And it's probably better if the US did not mediate that issue, that let the Chinese and the Indians work it out themselves as to what they can do. Now, in terms of the questions, I'll try to be as brief as I can, so I know there's a lot of people who want to get involved, is referring to John Bolton's book, which I just got and started reading, in that Trump, in effect, asked for Chinese assistance in the election. That has been rejected by a lot of people, and he has rather skimpy evidence of that, and it's more by insinuation than, in fact, by direct. I wouldn't put it past him to have done so, but I'm curious, since it's been so widely rejected. Now, on the U.S. relationship with China, there was a huge trade deal that the Chinese worked out and wanted to work out, because the Chinese want better relations with the U.S. In terms of importing $250 billion worth of farm products from the U.S. and a number of other things were done. And just this morning, I heard that Mr. Navarro, one of Trump's economic advisors, was questioning the continuity of that, and then afterwards he sort of took that back, because obviously the White House got back to him and said, no, this agreement is too important. So in terms of the U.S. relationship with Japan, which was also with China, which was also one of my questions, the U.S. clearly wants to develop a good trade relationship with China. It is somewhat suspicious of China's strategic questions. But I think that's something that the Asian powers themselves are probably best qualified to handle, though the U.S. comes in only if there is a direct threat from China, because none of them are strong enough to resist a direct threat, and only the U.S. could. On the U.S. and China, I think there's going to be an effort to keep the relationship as stable as possible because of important trade relations that the U.S. has with China. That gets me to your quote from Kissinger. Someone quoted from Kissinger about when a rising power reaches a certain point, it stabilizes. Yes and no on that. Germany, for example, at the turn of the last century, was a rising power, and by 1914, you could assume it had stabilized itself. But at that time, it really didn't have any sort of major areas of conquest, except it wanted more colonies. But other than that, the colonial grabs had more or less been finished by 1914. So it was somewhat reckless in its support of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which did have some territorial gains. So I'm not sure whether, that you reach a certain point and then stability, unless by stability, and I think Kissinger may have meant that, you mean that the domestic politics in a country is less prone to emotional calls for major policy differences that leads to a kind of uncertainty in the country. And that may be the case. If you mean it in a foreign policy sense, I think that there are problems with that. And I think history shows us enough, including Germany at the turn of the last century. In fact, Germany is an interesting example in the present context as well as an example of what China should avoid. Germany was offending all its neighbors in Europe, with maybe the possible exception of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but even then there was some problems with it as well. And as a consequence, when the war broke out, or when circumstances leading up to the war, its neighbors virtually all turned against it, because of their experience with a overly assertive Germany. China has to worry about the same thing. If it becomes too assertive, and it is around all its borders, you're going to find its neighbors beginning to cooperate with each other, in a sense, against China. And I think that is already starting to happen. Even the Russians are somewhat, the Russians have always been concerned about China. I think we sometimes exaggerate the Russian-Chinese relationship. There's always been a concern that the Chinese could be a threat, a long-term threat to the Chinese. They as well, are going to be careful. I think the Indians realize that, which is why I think they have worked at maintaining a good relationship with the Russians as well. Another question was, what can the U.S. do for India? I mean, I've already mentioned the logistics deal and that's been followed up by one with Australia, and that in itself is very important. There are still other things that India hasn't done to get the relationship closer in terms of military issues, but and the U.S. has not replaced the Russians as major source of weaponry. The Russia still remains, as the recent visit to Russia by Indian officials indicates, that they're shopping for all sorts of sophisticated Russian material. And the Russians have been cautious in how they have, handled and spoken about this issue between India and China. Then the other question, will be the last I'll answer, because I think you want to get on to other questions, is the point, Henry Kissinger's point about the rise of great powers, leads to stabilization, which I've already briefly addressed. That's true if you look at domestic politics, it's probably true. If you look at international politics, I don't think that necessarily is true, that there are other things that can upset it, that's a foreign origin, rather than, because he's really talking about domestic questions that can upset a relationship. And the very fact of what Germany did is an example of that, where it got very assertive in protecting its alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anyway, let me cut it there, because I think there are lots of people who want to get involved in the Q's and A's.
Thank you. May I now request Professor Swaran Singh to make his remarks?
Thank you, Pramod. Let me first say, I of course fully agree with my senior colleague, Professor Muni, and he raised this issue of how to deal with the dichotomy. And I agree that the complex interdependence is moving in a direction where the strategic will be privileged, as he said. That is true, and there is no two ways about it. But it's interesting, if you read the work I mentioned of Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye, Power and Interdependence Revisited, the last edition, 2011, they actually underline this, how complex interdependence would allow this dichotomy of power politics and economic liberalism. That is what has happened over years, and I understand United States was partly responsible for that enormous rise of China, but it was not being a benefactor. Both were pursuing their own national interests. It was partly to ensure socialization of China, so to say. And if we have to look at the reality completely from an academic point of view, it's not China. It's the rise of China that creates imbalance in that equilibria that we are discussing here. which these three nations have to ensure over a period of time. And that is primarily triggered by the fact that the economic prowess is now being leveraged by Chinese leaders to seek political influence. And that is where the power politics is being supported by that economic liberalism, is where the dichotomy is beginning to be far more complex and is deviating from the theoretical propositions as we have understood it. Let me try to answer a couple of questions that were raised as far as I am concerned. Why is United States not assisting India, or will it assist India? And how do I see China's long-term roles? China's long-term role would be just like of any rising power. Seek justice, undo injustices that happen to China in their own perception. Now, we may not agree with China's perceptions, but now they think they have the capability today to establish those territories as Chinese, which they always thought were Chinese, but were not given to Chinese or snatched away from Chinese. That's a reality. Will United States come in support of India? Yes, but only if it suits their national interests. Thanks to their own trade war going on with China, that they are so excited about getting into mediating in India-China relations in the very beginning of the tensions. So all three will fundamentally pursue their own national interests. If it fits in, look at example of Pakistan, where United States becomes friendly to Pakistan and then starts sort of admonishing Pakistan simply because of the relevance that Pakistan may have as a frontline state. So India's relevance would decide whether United States will support us or not. How is India's policy as far as protection of border and the conflict with China is concerned? We have very clearly seen that increasing sense of asymmetry is clearly understood among Indian power elite. And you look at the responses that I can go on giving you full details of how India's responses reflect that understanding of asymmetry with the Chinese. And that a pragmatic understanding will ensure that stability on the border stays on for a longer period of time. I can give longer details if somebody is interested later. Is people-to-people contact integral part of complex interdependence? Of course. People-to-people interdependence, transactions, interactions are part of that, as I said, multiple issues, multiple sectors, multiple actors, together creating that complex network of complex interdependence. Next question was about, is Pakistan looking at the China-India tensions and how Pakistanis view China-India tensions? Of course, this brings China and Pakistan closer to each other. I think either Professor Muni, I think he mentioned in the beginning how the Eastern Ladakh, our capacity to go on a metal road right up to Daulat Beg Oldie airfield and turn that potentially into tarmac, is threatening to both Pakistan and China. And therefore, China's sensitivity about that is not just because of its own interest, but also interest of its most allied ally called Pakistan. So definitely that is the problem that Chinese have as to why India is building that road particularly, and this whole flare-up has happened. Next question was, what about United Nations Security Council reforms? We can go on endlessly talking about it. We have different views on it. Today, I want to just quote what Indian Foreign Minister said in the trilateral meeting with the two colleagues, foreign ministers of Russia and China. He said, let us look at how UN Security Council was formulated. At that time, United Nations had only 50 member states. Today, United Nations has 193 member states. So if General Assembly's formulation has changed over a period of time in such a drastic fashion, perhaps that should also be reflected in some transformation that should occur in UN Security Council as well. Incidentally, India is joining from January again as an 8th time non-permanent member. So India is going to be very visible and active on UNSC on various issues as we move to post-COVID-19, reset or restart or transfer of kind of equations that have happened lately. Some of them are going to be accelerated. Some of that will be decided. So India will be sitting on those important positions. Last question to me, very interesting, was to talk about how is India viewing relationship with China and United States? Is it looking for I think that my old student and colleague now, Dr. Papari Chakrabarti, she's asking whether India is looking for absolute gains, mutual gains, or relative gains. She's fully familiar of IR theory. There's a whole debate about the whole theory of rational choice theory that we discuss, and these things come into that. let me put it in terms of cliche for making it much quicker and easier and almost caricature it to say, ideally speaking, any nation like India would look for absolute gains. They will formulate those in terms of mutual gains, but ultimately all we are trying to get is relative gains, and that's it in the relationship. Let me close here. Maybe there are more comments and questions. I really appreciate, because I see still 61 people, in fact 71 people are still with us. Hats off to Pramod for organizing such an excellent meeting.
Thank you, sir. We have like more than 30 questions, but maybe let's have one more round, not have all the 30 questions, if everyone has time. Professor Muni, Professor Walter, can we have another 10, 15 minutes?
Can we stay another 10, 15 minutes? I can stay, yes.
Okay. Muni,
I'm
sir?
here. I'm not going in.
Okay. So let's look at the last round of questions. For Professor Muni, is it plausible for India to side with the declining superpower? Should not it mend its relation with China and resolve regional conflicts? Second, South Asian countries are caught between strong powers like China, US, and India. For example, Nepal. Nepal itself has close ties with India, and now it's BRI. MCC with United States. What should these nations do for their self-interest? Third question is, do you think India-China border tension will divert Indian population from criticizing Modi's administration on handling of COVID, for example, economic unemployment rate and others? The last question is India going to embrace strategic autonomy, and is non-alignment going to be reserved? 4 questions for Walter Andersen. First is there any possibility of decoupling of economic ties between US and China in near future? Second, in what way does India-China-US complex interdependence would impact maritime security in South China Sea? Third, do you think that, now there is a need to change the structure of permanent membership in United Nations in Asian context? And fourth, can complex, third is do you think there is a need of United Nations Security Council, the structure of permanent membership? Do you think in terms of Asian context, it need to restructure?
It went blank. Your third question, I only got about a third of it.
Is there need for UN Security Council reforms?
Okay, that I got.
Okay, and last is, can complex interdependence survive if US keep on rejecting international institutions and regimes? For example, Trump decided to withdraw from World Health Organization. Is US shifting from neoliberal to neorealism? Now, 5 questions for Swaran Singh, because we got 4 in the initial round. So, with the erosion of faith from both US and China as world leader, are we moving towards a leaderless post-COVID world era? Second, in the current international world order, moving towards deglobalization in terms of economic nationalism, like international world moving towards deglobalization. Third is, how do we see people-to-people contact in the discussion of complex interdependence? I think he has picked that question earlier. How is Pakistan viewing the recent border dispute between India and China? And last is, how India can assert on its territorial conflict with China? Professor Muni, maybe we can start with you.
Yes, I'll start answering this question. But just a small comment. Swaran, you said somewhere that it is not the rise of China. Rise of China is a problem for the Americans. I would say it's not the rise of China only economic. It is the Chinese challenging the US which is a problem. If the Chinese had accepted the US international order in Asia and continued to have economic rise without challenging the US militarily, perhaps the tensions would have been much lower than what they appear to be. That's my feeling. Now, coming to the questions, why is India aligning with a declining superpower and not making up with the Chinese? The Chinese want subordinates. The Chinese want to be hegemonic power. India has never accepted even the American hegemony when it was unchallenged in the world at that time. And secondly, the very principle of balance is to side with the weaker power. Then only you maintain a balance. You don't, I mean, even earlier, for instance, if you look at it in terms of the balance of power, India's closer equations with the former Soviet Union, which was a weaker power. The Americans were an established and a supreme power at that time. But we thought in order to have a balance, we must tilt towards the former Soviet Union. And I think former Soviet Union also knew that it being a slightly weaker power, it must gather support from all other countries who are not allies, and therefore their softness towards the non-aligned movement, whatever else it was. Now, Nepal should decide what it should do with BRI and MCC. I have a feeling that Nepal would want to, like any other country, make the best advantage of whatever is on offer for them. And they have chosen to select both the MCC as well as BRI. What they have not done is to work out the long-term consequences of what can impinge upon their stakes and interests, either by getting very closely entrapped with the BRI or very closely entrapped with MCC. I mean, this is for the Nepalese to decide. I cannot give a policy guideline for them. Modi's COVID leadership is being debated and questioned, but you know, India is still doing relatively better despite this spike in the numbers in the COVID. In terms of our recoveries are much better, the deaths are still low, and we are a huge country. And we are a transparent country, unlike the Chinese. We do not know what is the actual number of the Chinese COVID cases have been. But in India, well, I think there are projections that we will probably reach our peak somewhere towards the end of October or early November. So it's still far off, and probably we will hit more than 1 million, maybe 2 million, maybe 5 million, some people say. So let us see what happens. But on the whole, the leadership is very concerned and very engaged with the consequences of the COVID, and we are trying to work on it. Now, non-alignment and strategic autonomy. In fact, it is the strategic autonomy which created non-alignment. The non-alignment was a product of accumulating the powers of the non-powers, because that made, and you would recall that India has a far better global clout as a very weak country during the non-aligned years than what it has now. Almost everybody was seeking India's intervention, whether it is a question of Korea or various other issues, or Indochina or various other issues which were there. And that was largely because it has accumulated all the non-aligned countries. Now the non-alignment is in a way irrelevant, because nobody is seeking alliances in the formal sense, as I said, and people are seeking partnerships. Even the allies are becoming more of a partner than allies. So I think this is more of an academic debate, I mean a classroom debate between strategic autonomy and non-alignment, rather than a policy debate. In terms of policy, you must maintain your independence as far as possible, because if there are constraints which you cannot overcome, then you will not be able to maintain your independence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Muni. Professor Walter Andersen.
Yeah, let me very, very briefly go through some of the questions here. Though I did want to make one preliminary comment, because it's come up a couple of times about the One Belt, One Road, and sometimes introduced as if it's a strength of the Chinese. I don't think so. I was in Shanghai during one of my sessions at Tongji when I was asked to address a group of African diplomats and economists, and that the issue came up, and it was an issue where they were all complaining about the high rates of interest that they had to pay and their lack of control over what was being spent. So it was not necessarily something that they saw as you know, developing a better relationship with China. You also have a very prominent Pakistani economist, Akbar Zaidi, who has written about this issue as well, that says that Pakistan has to watch out. It's going to find itself caught in a debt trap with the Chinese on this issue. And also complaining about Chinese workers when they come to Pakistan. They live in gated communities, virtually divorced from the population, something that the Americans have often been accused of in that. But it's not a way to sort of build close relationships. Quickly to go through some of the issues about a recoupling of the economy of the U.S. and China, I take it, to keep it back up to certain levels that it had been. It's likely, I mean, China is a huge economy, it has a huge population. It's going to demand raw materials. Interesting thing is the Chinese don't export many raw materials, import lots of raw materials, including quite a few from the U.S. That is likely to continue. In fact, it could, I think, significantly lower the trade gap. But many businesses are moving out of China because of rising costs and energy expenses in China. In fact, a couple of countries have actually established offices in Delhi to advise their companies about moving to India. And I think India needs to take a more assertive role on this. I know that because my wife has a business in India, and she's been approached by some of these people, particularly Koreans, who are moving out of China because they see kind of long-range problems for them because of the various issues of the Chinese. Now, a second question was about the maritime security in the South China Seas. The U.S. certainly, and Australians and Japanese and others, have never recognized the Chinese claims to sovereignty over the South China Sea. And therefore, they have ships every few months go through, and the Australians have joined that as well. So far, the Chinese really haven't, they've complained, but they haven't done anything about it. And I think this is something, given the range of traffic that goes both to Korea and to Japan through the South China Sea, this is something that, I think the world community is going to be alert to ensure that those seas stay open. And that's going to be a question to find out to what extent the Chinese try to, in any sense, block that, given the fact of the creation of these artificial islands, which have maritime bases on them. Now, the need for UN Security Council reform, that normally means expanding the number of countries on the UN, in the UN Security Council. I think there should be personally, but I know there's a debate in the US government over the validity of that. I think if push comes to shove, the US would probably support it. I'm almost positive the Chinese would not support it. And they can block it if they want to, and they will continue to block it. They do not want to see another Asian power on the UN Security Council, and they certainly don't want to see India on that. Now, is the US shifting from neoliberalism and international bodies, and the WTO was used as an example on that? To a certain extent, that's probably true. If the Democrats get back into power, as is very likely in the coming elections, I think you'll see more efforts at globalization. But one of the issues in the US has been that globalization has resulted in many factories moving to countries that have lower labor practices and don't have the same kind of protections of labor that the US does. And I think, the Democrats are going to need labor, and so they will be concerned about that happening as well. So there may be more, support for restricting, international agreements that affect U.S. labor. You can look at the proposed Pacific Economic Agreement, where both the Democrats and the Republicans pulled out of that, and that was one of the factors that they're doing so. So I think that that's an issue that. It's not going to be totally one way, totally other. It'll be somewhere in between, but they'll probably somewhat, like all issues, given domestic U.S. concerns, particularly about labor and the very high, regulations we have about labor protection that often is missing in many other countries.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Professor Swaran Singh?
Thank you. I think I always get to learn a great deal from Professor Muni. And I think that I, again, fully agree. Let me just add quickly how the rise of China makes distinction from Chinese, ulterior motives sometimes, which is how people explain what is happening in terms of China influencing global order. Look back until the modern times when we saw European expansion around the world. All earlier empires, Ottoman Empire, Mongol Empire, they were driven primarily by war, capacity to showcase crude military power. European imperialism was driven primarily by economic expansion followed by strategic expansion. United States was an aberration in second half of 20th century because of two world wars, its global expansion and the outreach that Paul Kennedy talks about, rise and fall of great powers. United States global outreach happened primarily because of strategic impulsions or compulsions or impulses, not by economic compulsions. And therefore, you see repeatedly United States falls back to isolationist impulses. They want to go back home. China is not like that. China globally has expanded economically, and the strategic expansion is a follow-up of that. That is what makes the rise of China distinct from earlier sort of powers of late 20th century, the way they conducted themselves in influencing global order. So that's why I make distinction between the rise, economic particularly rise of China, and what it is doing to the global order. Related question from there was how the decoupling, deglobalization that was asked to me is going to be an opportunity. And Walter mentioned a great deal how India can, really, sort of make great advantage India out of that. Trust me, companies that are moving out of China are first of all being encouraged to move back to their countries of origin. Japanese, for example, have openly declared $2 billion of help in case Japanese companies want to come home. Second, companies that are not going home, we have other competitors. Vietnam is a competitor, Indonesia is a competitor, Thailand is a competitor. India is not the only most loved country around the world in that sense. Third important point, Chinese are themselves trying to make sure that the low quality, low skilled, low value production is allowed to move out of China now. They are moving now gradually into high value addition sectors, precision instruments, brands, they are moving into brands. And therefore, yes, India can take certain amount of advantage, but this is not the way decoupling is being announced as if we are going to isolate China, like North Korea. That's not going to happen. Chinese are learning lessons. If you look at their, government work report, 9,000 words, this Li Keqiang just submitted to the National People's Congress, they are reorchestrating their own growth rates. They are also trying to become United States, focus on domestic consumption. United States is not run by foreign trade. Therefore, they don't have to worry about stakes outside. They only go to fight. Chinese have stakes because they live and grow because of foreign trade. They're shifting that now to enhance domestic production and move towards high quality production. Very closely related question was, if there is an erosion of trust on both United States and China, is there a space for India? Yes, no doubt about it. In fact, a whole lot of retired diplomats are talking about it, how India can use that enormous space, which is now available because there's a lack of trust on both China and United States because they are continuously on loggerheads for 18 months plus now. But I don't know how we can turn that into advantage India. That's not really going to be easy. The other question was, how will India protect its own territory? I don't think it's a very difficult question to answer because any nation, when it comes to national territorial sovereignty, particularly for post-colonial states, these states are obsessed with territories, territorial sovereignty. They are the prestige. Every inch of territory is how we talk about it. When you are talking of a territory of confusion with with China, of a territory equal to, let's say, Greece, equal to Bangladesh, that is the size of territory we are talking in contention here. But we talk in terms of every inch of the territory. So there's a national prestige attached to it. So India will try every card that it has, whether it is the military strategy, military procurements. We have just paid money to Russia today to buy S-400. It's a perfect timing, and US cannot oppose it anymore because we are in a tight bend as we want to explain it. So India will try all methodologies of diplomatic conversation, informal summits, and then sort of walk around the woods, all possibilities to ensure every part of Indian territory is protected because that is integral part of national honor is how it is viewed. And I think that is the last question to me because other two questions about how Pakistan looks at India-China tensions I have answered. And I've also answered already the people-to-people component of the complex interdependence template, which I'm trying to use to explain. In fact, I'm told today that the topic today was US, China, India, complex interdependence. And I was using that template to explain what is happening to the relationship in that sense. So I hope I made sense when I said that if you use the template, the relationship of these three is moving in China, becoming increasingly autonomous and assertive, and pushing United States and India closer, not necessarily because India is bandwagoning. India is too large and too self-respecting to bandwagon any country. But these are the broader trends in the canvas, which are pushing these countries to come closer, and they will come closer. It's not an issue of United States' relative decline and India is supporting a sinking ship. No, United States will continue to be very influential country for decades because it has advantages in many, many sectors. It's not just economic growth that matters. Many other things matter. And therefore, I don't think we should really overestimate that relative decline of United States and caricature in terms of US going down the drain. Absolutely not. So India's calibrated response in engaging various countries, and Professor Muni mentioned about strategic autonomy, multi-alignments, that's what is guiding India's foreign policy of building as many partnerships with as many countries as possible, including United States and China, to the extent we can. So that's the complex interdependence where we are trying to achieve certain amount of equilibrium, which helps push India's national interest. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to thank all the panelists. Thank you, Professor Walter Andersen, Professor Muni, and Professor Singh. It was really a great discussion and we learned a lot. I'm sure our participants also enjoyed and learned from this discussion. On behalf of NICE and all our participants, I'd like to thank all our speakers for excellent presentation and valuable time. Thank you so much. We're also thankful to our wonderful audience. Hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.